Welcome to episode 131 of the Microsoft Cloud IT Pro podcast, recorded live June 20th, 2019. This is a show about Office 365 and Azure from the perspective of IT pros and end users, where we discuss a topic or recent news and how it relates to you. In today's episode, we cover part 2 of a recent discussion Ben delivered to the Microsoft Teams Virtual Summit on Microsoft Teams governance and how to think about controlling and limiting the functionality and content within your Microsoft Teams environment. And we have moved forward to another Friday, another wonderful Friday of me in hot, muggy, steamy, rainy, humid Florida.
It is Thursday.
It is Thursday.
Nice try. I am in foggy Midtown Manhattan, and I cannot see the river. It's so foggy, I can't even, from my hotel, see out that way. It's kind of sad.
That is kind of sad. So neither one of us are in a bright, happy, sunny place.
No. But we're going to talk about bright, happy, sunny things.
We are. We are going to pick up where we left off last week in the whole Teams governance thing and kind of talking through that session I did at the Teams Summit around governing your Microsoft Teams environment. So last week we talked about Teams creation, kind of automating it, blocking Office 365 groups, how all of the creation aspects of Teams actually tie together. And this week, we're going to kind of dive into, okay, you have your governance around that Teams lifecycle, creation, deletion of Teams. What about functionality or content in Teams? Because governance just isn't about what you can or can't create, but it's about what you can or can't do, and also how you manage the content within these environments. So that's going to be kind of part 2 of our Teams governance, is both the Teams functionality governance aspects and then governance around content in Teams.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Let's get into it.
As IT professionals in the cloud era, sometimes it feels like we don't speak the same language as the rest of the organization. So when stakeholders from finance or other departments start asking about a specific project or Teams Azure costs, they don't always realize how much work is involved in obtaining that information, sifting through cluttered CSVs and a complex mess of metadata in order to manually create custom views and reports. It's a real headache. On top of helping you understand and reduce your organization's overall Azure spend, ShareGate Overcast lets you group resources into meaningful cost hubs and map them to real-world business scenarios. This way, you can track costs in the way that makes most sense with your corporate structure, whether it's by product, business unit, team, or otherwise. It's a flexible, intuitive, and business-friendly way of tracking Azure infrastructure costs, and it's only available in ShareGate Overcast. Find out more on sharegate.com/ITPro. All right, so Teams functionality. There are a few different aspects to think about when you think about this Teams functionality. So the first is within your Teams Admin Center. And before we even get into some of these features, I do want to call out that some settings are in the new Teams Admin Center, and some settings are still in the Office 365 Admin Center, and every once in a while you still do need to go over to the Escape for Business Admin Center when you get into some of the voice stuff, but there are different places to go to look at some of these different settings.
And I think that kind of makes sense, because we talked about last time that Teams is multiple workloads.
Exactly.
It's a front end for a bunch of different things. So sometimes you might have to go into those tenant services to configure something that materially affects Teams, whether it's your content, your client, whatever it is.
Exactly. So from a governance perspective, there's not going to be a whole lot to be done really in the Skype for Business Admin Center, unless you're starting to deal with some of the phone numbers and stuff. The 2 primary places you're going to want to go when you're looking at configuring Teams functionality within your environment is first, just the Office 365 Admin Center, so admin.microsoft.com. And then if you go look under Services and Add-ins, there is a menu item under your Services and Add-ins, under your settings for Microsoft Teams. what you will see up at the top is a little dialog that says, important, removing Teams admin settings to the new Microsoft Teams and Skype for Business Admin Center. If the setting is unavailable here, it's already been moved over there. But there are still some settings there. So from an org-wide perspective, some of the governance settings you want to think about is the first one is maybe whether or not you even want to allow guest access to your environment. If you're going to allow people to add guests to your Teams environment, and if you're going to allow users in your Teams to invite guests in. So this is one setting that should be, it looks like it may have gotten moved in mine. I have seen it both places, both in the Microsoft Teams under services and add-ins, in terms of being able to allow guest creation there. Actually, in mine now, it is under the org-wide settings in the new Teams Admin Center. If you go to guest access, the very first radio button is just allow guest access in Teams or not allow guest access in Teams. So that's one of those big settings that you kind of want to decide right away, because if people start inviting guests in, it may be too late. So this is, I believe this one is now on by default for your org-wide settings.
It is, yes.
And then once you have decided kind of what guest access, if you're going to allow guest access or not, you do have a whole bunch of settings at that organizational-wide level. So when we're talking organizational-wide level, this isn't specifying these settings for a given team or a given channel. This is every single team within your tenant. Are you going to allow these settings or not? So with under this guest access in the new Microsoft Teams Admin Center, you have things like if your guests are going to be able to allow or make private calls. So actually doing voice calls within your Microsoft Teams environment. And then you have certain settings around meetings. So if you're going to allow IP video in your meetings for guests or not, if you're going to allow guests to have screen sharing, and even what that screen sharing setting is. So you can disable it completely. You can say, you know what, they're only going to be able to share applications, or they're going to be able to share their entire screen. And then you also have settings around messages. And this is things like whether guests can edit messages that they send or if they can delete them, if chat for those guests is enabled or disabled. So you may only want guests to be able to communicate within a channel or to be able to carry on that conversation within a channel in a team and not send private messages to other users in your organizations via chat. So you can turn off chat, you can turn off GIFs, you can set the rating on those GIFs, memes, stickers. So all of these different settings that you may want to apply organizational-wide around what those guests can or can't do to, again, maybe you don't want them to be able to do IP video or to be able to do screen sharing for security reasons, for sensitivity reasons, or to be able to make calls or chat so they can essentially chat with anybody in your organization. These are those org-wide settings that you really want to think about. What functionality should just guests be able to do within Teams or outside of Teams?
Correct. And then you have to be able to bring your users up to speed on that as well. So I've been in tenants before where some of the settings for things like guests being able to share their screens is not on. So the very first time that you're on a call and you say, hey, can you share your screen with me? And they go, no, I can't. And you go, oh, no. There's certainly some end user considerations as well for consumption of these products by your users, not just the guests who come into that tenant.
Exactly. Kind of once you move on from guests, or even before you get to guests, you also have your team settings. So this is another one of those that is organizational wide. This is teams across the board. And this is more when you start getting into your end user settings and maybe some of those settings that you want your end users to do. These, when you get into team settings, internal users and guests are controlled differently. So a lot of those guest settings, you can't set organizational wide for your internal users. And we'll get into that in a little bit how you kind of control some of those same settings for internal users. But team settings, organizational wide, this is something that you really should go in and look at right away, because there's a few key items in here that are enabled by default that you may want to disable. So within your team settings, you do have things like the email integration, if you're going to allow email addresses for different channels. But the one that actually surprises me, and I don't know that everybody realizes this, is that Files tab in a team by default has the option for your users to go in and add ShareFile, Dropbox, Box, or Google Drive as cloud storage to the Files tab in your Microsoft team. So if you're rolling out teams and you're concerned about governance, about data loss, about where people are storing things, and you're not maybe blocking these at the firewall level, users may still be using Teams, but then storing all their files in some other third party rather than using the SharePoint site associated with Teams. So one of the settings that you can do org-wide is go in and disable the ability for them to add ShareFile, Dropbox, Box, Google Drive, any number of those. It's a checkbox for each one within your team. And that is one of those that is on by default in Teams. When Microsoft first enabled it, it was on. So that may be one that you want to go in and shut those off right away if your corporate policy is, hey, SharePoint is our location for those cloud-based file shares.
That's a little bit of a weird one. Like you said, it is on by default, and you have to make that decision. Do you monitor it? Do you allow that? Maybe you go through some of Microsoft's CASB tools or another proxy or something just to see what happens. But it can be difficult to get insight into what's going on once you open the floodgates and the stuff's out there.
Absolutely. So that's kind of the big one from that org-wide setting. You have a couple other ones around devices and how meeting room devices operate in terms of requiring PINs, authentication to access meeting content, resource accounts, being able to send messages that are tied with these room devices and conference rooms. But those are kind of those big team settings for internal users. Within the new Teams Admin Center, one of the settings that may be valuable to you that is still over in the old Admin Center or in the services and add-ins, Microsoft Teams and that Office 365 Admin Center, is being able to manage external applications within your Teams environment. Again, this is one that's enabled by default. People can go in, they can install external third-party apps. They can go and install a bunch of the Office 365 included apps, OneNote Planner, Power Apps, SharePoint, Weather, Wunderlist, Yammer, all of those different apps. Within the apps settings, under your tenant-wide settings in Microsoft Teams, in services and add-ins, you can go through and pick and choose what of those first-party apps you want users to be able to use. So if you don't want them to be able to maybe connect Dynamics 365, or if you don't want them using Yammer within Teams, you want all those conversations to happen in Teams, you want to disable Yammer within Teams, you can go in and uncheck those checkboxes and pick and choose which first-party apps you want to allow within Teams. And then if you go down to that next level of external apps, unfortunately, it doesn't let you pick and choose by default external apps, but you can set to allow or not allow external apps in Microsoft Teams, whether you want to allow side loading of external apps, and then if you want to enable new external apps by default. So some of these settings around those default apps, what apps people are allowed to use in Teams, again, if you have certain policies set up in terms of where data goes, where people manage tasks, which applications people use, you probably want to go take a look at these apps and maybe make some slight tweaks based on your organizational policies to really help, again, govern where content goes and what features people have available in terms of those apps within their Teams environment.
I'm not overly familiar with it. Once you deploy, because we talked about maybe custom apps a little bit last week and kind of having maybe another business process that helps you manage creation of Teams sites, something else.
Yep.
Can you turn those on and off through that same UI after that, or is that a kind of like redeploy it, pull it back out kind of thing?
That's a good question. I honestly don't know how that would work if you're deploying your own apps, because that's essentially now an external app in Teams, and I don't know You're not supposed to ask me questions I don't know the answer to, Scott.
No, it's fine.
But it's a good question. I don't know how this actually works if you're developing your own internal custom apps in terms of deploying those.
TBD. You'll get back to me.
Yes. Or if somebody has some insight and has played with blocking apps as well as creating their own custom third-party apps, feel free to leave us a comment or shoot us an email, and we can fill people in on a later episode.
I would tell them to come and visit us on Reddit and leave a comment there.
Yeah, we've started having a few conversations here and there in our Reddit channel. So if you aren't, or in our subreddit, we're talking about teams. I get channels on the brain. So yeah, if you're not, if you want to come join us in our subreddit, go look us up. We'll put a link to that in the show notes so you can go click on it and have conversations in Reddit all around various podcast episodes. Upskillity is disrupting cloud training as we know it with their on-demand platform, SkillMeUp. Their new design focuses on a user flow to better support role-based learning paths with these great new features. Real-time, hands-on labs are now included with each subscription to build your skills competence. Hundreds of cloud courses with more added daily to transform your skills for today's cloud-first careers. Role-based learning paths guide you through associated level courses in an easy-to-view layout and tracker. Microsoft Azure and Microsoft 365 certification prep courses and labs to support you leading up to exam day. Learn more and start your free 3-day trial at www.skillmeup.com.
So what's next?
Meeting policies. So this is what actually gets into some of those guest settings that we talked about around what you're going to allow with, in terms of video, in terms of sharing apps or sharing your screen, in terms of memes and stickers and GIFs or GIFs. I can't remember what I said last time. I still don't know what the proper pronunciation is.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. That is done within meeting policies. So under meetings in the new Teams Admin Center, you have meetings policies where you can go, you have some policies by default that you can't modify, something like all on or all off. And then you have your global org-wide policy in there. You have some kiosk policies, restricted policies, but then you can also go create your own custom policies. And as you're looking through these, some of these you can modify, some of them you can't. All on, all off, locked down, that policy can't be changed. Something like your global org-wide one, they let you modify because you may want a different default policy. But within these policies are those types of settings that are things like whether you're going to allow a meet now in a channel, or if you want your users to have the Outlook add-in so they can schedule Teams meetings from Outlook. If you're going to allow transcriptions, IP videos, screen sharing settings, PowerPoint whiteboard, share notes. If you're going to allow an external participant to give or request control of your screen if you're doing screen sharing. Anonymous people starting meetings, dial-in users bypassing the lobby, a bunch of different settings there around your meetings in your Microsoft Teams. So this is those policies for meetings that apply to your internal users. And the one goofy thing about these policies is you can only apply them to a user.
I was going to say that. That's an important thing, right?
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is a big deal that actually came up when I was giving this session is, can you apply this to a group? And it's like, well, no. It is user by user. I believe I saw a conversation somewhere that, or maybe I think I asked it in a later session that Microsoft was actually doing about, are you going to be able to apply these meetings to groups? And if I'm remembering right, that functionality is coming, but it is not there yet. So if you want to apply this to large groups of users, you better script this out. If you have default settings that users get, you probably want to set a script to run regularly, or you want to set that global org-wide default to what you really want. And then after they're created, if they need some additional privileges, you go assign them to a new policy, because it really is only assigned user by user. And a user can only belong to one policy. So from a management perspective, it does make it a little bit easier in that you can't end up with a user that has 3 policies and you have to figure out which one wins. If you go change the policy of a user, they will be automatically removed from the policy they're currently in. So as you go in, add users to policies, remove users from policies, they will get automatically transitioned out of an existing policy. They will never have two policies applied to them. Again, that does make it a little bit easier. That does help out, at least from knowing what's applied. But until they get this for groups, it can be a little bit of a bear to manage, especially if you're dealing with hundreds or thousands of users and you're not just dealing with like 10 or 15 users.
And also dealing with multiple policies, because you will start to end up with that cognitive overload of having, like you said, a few of them, and potentially transitioning users through testing and just having a life cycle to this per user setting effectively.
Yeah, it definitely, it makes it interesting with these meeting policies and how they get assigned. So those are kind of the biggest areas that come out when you start talking about managing that functionality and how you manage kind of that functionality at a high level of what users can and can't do in Teams. Once you kind of get beyond that, you start getting into more of that content within Teams and what your users can or cannot do when it comes to chatting, uploading files, sharing files, all of that. So as with your org-wide settings, there's a few different things to think about. Just like with meeting policies in Microsoft Teams, we also have messaging policies. So if you go look at your messaging policies, same type of thing. You have a global org-wide default, not a custom policy. You can go in and modify that. That is the only one by default. You can go in then and create additional custom policies here. Same type of thing, only assigned to users. Users can only belong to one policy at a time. But this is where you control what users do when it comes to messaging. Some of that other guest functionality we talked about in terms of if your internal users are allowed to chat or edit and delete messages, if they can use stickers, if you're going to have URL previews in the chat. So if they paste in a URL, do you get a preview of the website? If you're going to allow translation of messages, priority notifications, voice message creation, mobile device, displaying favorite channels above your recent chats, if users can remove users from a group chat. So a lot of those settings then around content within your chats are set within those messaging policies that, again, are assigned user by user. So this isn't assigning within this team. Users can have this perform these this chat functionality or messaging functionality. This is a user across all of their teams, across all of Microsoft Teams, has these policies applied to them in terms of what they can or cannot do.
When it comes to applying those policies, I know you can apply them through the admin center. Is that something that can be done with PowerShell as well to kind of bulk administer, or is it just the Teams admin center today? Do you happen to know off the top of your head?
Clicky through the admin center. No, it's not. It's PowerShell.
Ah, perfect.
I just wanted to give everybody a momentary heart attack there.
Sometimes based on the way this stuff comes out, I don't think it's a weird question.
I believe this is all PowerShell. I know the meeting policies are. I'm pretty sure when I went and looked at the Teams PowerShell module, it had all of this stuff in there. And if I can ramble for a minute, I can go look. But team membership settings, team guest settings, team users. This is not the correct documentation, I don't think. Messaging settings. Get team messaging settings. Set team messaging settings. This doesn't look like all the PowerShell commands. I'm pretty sure when I went and looked this up, you can do it with PowerShell.
Gotcha.
I think all of this stuff was scriptable.
We'll leave it at that.
Yes, we will. And then we will move on to some other fun features. So another thing to think about is, in this one, we're going to stick in this whole chat vein messaging policies. And this is relatively new. I can't remember when this rolled out for Teams chat, but it's this concept of supervision within Teams. So this has been available for Exchange for a while, and they have made it available now to Teams chat, where it is a monitoring feature. So don't think of this as blocking, but you can set up policies for supervision where you can either set up sensitive information to be monitored or supervised, or you can set an intelligent filters. Intelligent filters is just rolling out. Right now, there is only one intelligent filter out there, and it is for I think the official name of it is abusive language. So this supervision feature will actually monitor your chats. It does monitor emails as well. And if you're using these intelligent filters, it'll automatically detect if there's some type of abusive language happening within chats, within Teams conversations, and set out alerts that, hey, there's some inappropriate language occurring within these chat conversations. Or if you're doing the sensitive information, it's, hey, there's credit cards that are being shared within these chat messages, or bank statements, or personal PII, personally identifiable information. That one's always a mouthful. But it won't block those conversations from happening, but it will give you those alerts via a shared mailbox. There's a supervision dashboard, or you'll get like alerts and Outlook on the web of these types of occurrences within your Microsoft Teams chat. So it's a way for you to keep an eye on it, for you to have a record of, hey, there's some conversations happening that we need to go look at, we need to go take care of, we need to go talk to this person. And you can even set the percentage of what you're alerted on. So it's kind of weird. It's like, okay, let me know at 10%, 20%, 100% when these are detected. And the detection, how quickly this is detected does vary. Mail should be real time. Teams can take up to 24 hours, so there is a little bit of a delay there. It's necessarily something you're going to see immediately, and it's just because of how Teams works. But this is one of those features, too, with the supervision that you should go look at, go see if this is something you want to go enable in your environment, to just kind of keep an eye on what types of conversations, or if there's inappropriate conversations happening within Teams or even within your email.
Do you happen to know, and I'm sorry to keep asking you questions, you probably feeling Johnny on the spot. Do you happen to know for that one, is that gated to licensing, or is that available to everyone who does Teams?
I knew you were going to ask that because I can't remember.
Excellent. Well,
Supervision policies.
I got it for you. You must have a Microsoft E365 E5 compliance license, or an Office 365 E3 with advanced compliance add-on, or Office 365 E5.
I just found the same thing. So there is some licensing there that you would have to take into consideration, which could bring us into our topic for next week. Nope, we're not going to go there.
Nope, not this week.
Not this week. Mover is a cloud migration company that specializes in moving your company's files from file servers or cloud storage like Box, Dropbox, and Google into Office 365. Their patented technology makes Mover the fastest OneDrive file migrator in the world. Moving dozens of terabytes of data a day is a breeze. Use Mover's free, industry-leading migration guides, or ask for a managed migration and they'll take the lead. With Mover, all your data is secure and intact. Running completely behind the scenes, you don't lose time, money, or hair while you transfer. Scan, plan, migrate, report. Migrations that don't suck with Mover. Visit mover.io for more info. A couple other things that you may want to take a look at too when it comes to the whole data monitoring, data loss prevention. How'd you like that transition? You can do data loss prevention with Teams. And this is one of those too where it does span all the services, because you want to think about data loss prevention here for your Exchange, your Teams mailbox, your SharePoint sites, which are your Teams files, your OneDrive accounts, because certain files shared via chats are stored in OneDrive if they're shared within Teams, and then your Teams chat and channel messages, so your conversations within Teams. You can now apply data loss prevention to all 4 of these locations, and if you really are doing data loss prevention, you should go in and apply this to all 4 of them, so that again, that sensitive information. So this data loss prevention does primarily work off those sensitive information types, which Microsoft has defined, or there was a podcast we talked about those too, and that you can go in and define your own data loss prevention policies. But as opposed to supervision, this is what's going to go in and actually prevent data from escaping from your organization, being shared with external users. And it is nice that they have this for Teams chat and channel messages too, because if you're just blocking it for email, SharePoint, and OneDrive, and you're not blocking it for Teams chat, all that information that you might be trying to block in those other 3 technologies, people may just be going into Teams and sharing it because it actually gets through there. So go in, think about this data loss prevention. If you're worried about it in Exchange and SharePoint and OneDrive, make sure you've enabled it for Teams too, especially because Teams was one of those services that was rolled out later than the other three in terms of being able to apply those data loss prevention policies to it.
There's a little bit of nuance there, right? Where Teams, it needs that specific policy for chat messages, like you said. It's a additive step, and you absolutely have to go in and do it.
Exactly. And then retention policies is the last one. So this is another one that has been around for Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, even Office 365 groups in terms of being able to retain your data for 7 years, for 50 years, for 6 months, based on retention labels, retention policies. You can set how long data should be retained for. This also now exists for your Teams channels and messages and Teams chats. So you can set these retention policies now to retain conversations within Teams to be saved for a certain amount of time. And just like DLP, this is one that was rolled out recently, and you have to go in and apply it. And aside from that, because of how it works, Teams actually requires its own retention policy for chats and channel messages. So if you go create a channel or a retention policy, go enable Teams, it'll disable Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Office 365 groups, Skype for Business, public folders, all of those. So you have to have two separate retention policies for every retention policy you have. One that applies to all the other services and one that applies to your Teams channel messages and Teams chats. And the Teams channel messages and chats do work a little different in that if you have looked at how Teams works under the covers, all of this information is actually stored within Azure, within Teams itself. However, if you do retention policies, these chats and conversations are actually copied out of the Teams storage into the hidden folders within your Exchange mailbox or within the shared mailbox for the 365 group that's associated with the team. And those retention policies, then that copy of that chat history is retained in those mailboxes rather than being retained in that team storage sitting off in Azure somewhere.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that one either. I am learning all sorts of new stuff today.
Yes, I actually learned that as part of this. I didn't realize how all that worked either, but it is, because people ask, they're like, well, how are all these conversations stored in Teams if you delete the Teams and all that? And yeah, there's a copy of it actually retained in conversation mailboxes. So it works a lot like Skype used to, where those conversations were actually saved in mailboxes. Teams conversations with retention policies, exact same thing.
Awesome.
So that kind of gives us a good summary of governance of that session I did. And as with my other session, it took about an hour to go through it between part 1 and part 2. So if you're just catching this one, go back and listen to episode 129. That was part 1 of Teams governance. This is part 2.
Perfect. Well, I learned a couple new things today. I appreciate it.
Good. Not a problem. Glad I could teach you today, Scott.
Next week, we're going to teach each other.
All right. Sounds good. We will definitely teach each other next week. Next week should be a fun one if we go with the topic we were discussing earlier. And as long as you make it back from traveling safely.
Yeah, as long as I survive India.
Yes.
Which I will. I'm gonna have a good time.
All right.
Yeah, thanks for the time.
Not a problem. Thank you. Enjoy your trip. Safe travels and have fun in India. And we will talk to you next week.
Thanks, bud.
Yep. Bye-bye, Scott. If you enjoyed the podcast, go leave us a 5-star rating in iTunes. It helps to get the word out so more IT pros can learn about Office 365 and Azure. If you have any questions you want us to address on the show or feedback about the show, feel free to reach out via our website, Twitter, or Facebook. Thanks again for listening and have a great day.